Hey, Chuck.
Fred, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm excellent, thank you. Good to see you.
Good. Good to see
We
you.
missed you.
You were down and out the last meeting I was on
Oh
for.
man, I had that respiratory thing, and I could not kick it. Oh my
Yeah,
God,
it's going
it
around. We've
was.
had several neighbors with that this
Oh,
winter.
it it
Wow.
it. Without going into too much detail, it turns into like bronchitis, and you can't stop coughing, and there's nothing they can do for you.
Yeah.
Terrible,
Wow.
terrible.
Doesn't
Good to see
doesn't
you, my
sound
man.
good. Hmm.
It's
Say
good to
again.
see you.
Oh, it's good. It's good to be seen, Chuck.
Yeah, we missed you, Fred.
Well, sometimes I miss the meetings, but not always.
Yep. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to turn off the video, but it's nice to see you. I'll be lurking here.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure, Fred. Thank you for joining us.
Hmm.
Evening, Francesco.
Hi, Chuck. Good evening.
How are you?
Very well. And yourself?
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Good.
Got a busy agenda here this evening as a follow-up to our last meeting. And rather than me take up any of the precious time, I do have some comments, which I'll make as we get to individual slides. Interested in everybody's input and thank everybody for joining us. With that, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. And thanks everyone for making some time this evening. It's good to see you again. Happy February. And let's take a look at our agenda. So as we usually do, we'll take a look at where we are on the project schedule, and we're on track. We're following our schedule, so that's good. And then I want to discuss recently approved or adopted amendments, which should be very familiar to you because they were before you in the past month. And I want to talk about how we're going to handle those and how we're going to bring those adopted amendments into the zoning regulations document. Then we will very briefly review the parking amendments that we drafted in response to our discussion last month. And then we'll move on to the bulk of our meeting, which is really intended to get into the details on your landscaping, screening, and buffering requirements, of which there's plenty to talk about. And then, as usual, we'll talk about our next steps. So with respect to our phase 2 schedule, here we are in the drafting process of drafting recommended amendments for site design, parking, and sign regulations. And we still have another month or so of work to go on this. Our meeting next month will be used for the last part of this, which will be to review your sign regs. And then there'll be some follow-up work in April as we come back to you with the recommended amendments that we've drafted. All right, so let's talk about your recently approved or adopted amendments. First of all, you restored the height exemption that had been in the regs prior to our phase 1 work. It does allow for some flexibility for certain building structures to project above the maximum height limit. So it's very clear what is expected of us, and we've already updated the zoning regulations document. I should note that that is currently effective. So if you have any applications that were to come in yesterday or today, then that adopted amendment is in place, even though we haven't released the newest version of the document. Next, and more substantially, are the cannabis regulations that were originally adopted in 2022, but were not included in the phase 1 rewrite. You recently agreed to, as you rightly should have, to integrate them into the zoning regulations document because they had been passed and approved. And I do want to talk about the format by which we do that. So I've got a couple of slides to this effect that I added today at Clifton's request that may not have been in the packet that was sent to you. So the amendment that you passed and adopted provided very specific guidance on how the regulation should be amended in response to what was adopted. However, the guidance it provides with respect to really what I consider to be a formatting issue is unconventional with our approach. And it really comes down to 2 uses that you do not permit, meaning you prohibit them in the town of Stonington. So of the various cannabis uses that you do permit, cannabis cultivators, and you can see the row highlighted in yellow, and cannabis dispensary facilities are not permitted anywhere in Stonington, in any zone or district. And the guidance we're provided in the document that you adopted showed these listed in the use table, and of course, not permitted in any zone. So just hash marks through each permitted, through each use in each cell. The issue I have with this approach is that this is a permitted use summary table. That's how we describe it. And it only lists uses that are permitted in some zone somewhere in the town. And you can see I've circled permitted principal uses. We do not list prohibited uses in this table, of which you do have lots of prohibited uses. We've reserved the use of this table for permitted uses. So it doesn't make sense to me to list uses that are not permitted anywhere in town here. I do agree that it is important to prohibit those uses if that's what is intended, as I understand it was. But I think we should do that in another way within the document. So let me move forward. So first of all, we would not, what I'm recommending is that we not include list uses that you prohibit in the use summary table. So we would not provide these rows. All the rest would be provided as you see, because that's exactly what you adopted. And instead, we would provide a section within the use regulations, and you've adopted all of this. You put limits on the number of establishments and that sort of thing. This is the section that you approved to add to the zoning regulations, 5.3.27, cannabis establishments. I instead recommend that within this section, we add a subsection or item B that identifies prohibited uses. And that would look like this: prohibited uses, cannabis cultivator and cannabis dispensary facility. Furthermore, you adopted the state's definitions for all of these uses, which is word for word how the state defines them in statute, which is fine. And for all your permitted uses, we will add, in fact, we've already done so, the definitions of these cannabis type establishments to your use definitions at the back of the document. Much like our use summary table, we do not define within our use definitions uses that are prohibited. We either don't define them or we define them elsewhere within the regulations, with the idea being that the use summary table is a use or is a list or a summary of uses allowed in the town, as is your definitions. It's a list of definitions of permitted uses. Instead, we recommend just pointing to the statutory definition and basically not giving a lot of oxygen to something that's not permitted in town. Now, I defer to your opinion as a commission, and if you feel you need to consult with the town's attorney on this, I understand that as well. I see this as a formatting issue, right? We're still talking about prohibiting these types of uses. Is just a question of how do we document that within the regulations. And that's my perspective. If you want us to amend the regulations exactly as it was described in the motion that you made and in that document, then we'll do exactly that. But if we were to do this in a format that's consistent with the way we're handling everything else, we would do it in the way that I've described. So that's my piece. With that being said, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Chuck, if you have any initial thoughts on this.
Francisco, this is Clifton.
Clifton, yeah, go ahead.
It looks like Chuck dropped off briefly.
Okay.
I think he was having some connection trouble. Again, just for everyone that's on, Francisco and I spoke about this, and I'm in agreement that it's a formatting issue, and we can carry the spirit of what was approved by the commission through the updates that he's recommending. But yeah, we would be looking for the commission to also concur with that assessment. That way we wouldn't have to bring it back for an amendment or a public hearing at a later date.
This is Lynn. I agree with this proposal. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Lynn. Did anyone else have thoughts or concerns?
No, Dave Resendes, I agree. It makes sense. Do we have prohibited establishments in for any other uses?
We do. We
In our
have
code?
we have a whole section of the regulations that identifies prohibited uses, and that's section 4.3. And we identify mostly like heavy industrial uses that aren't permitted, junkyards, that sort of thing. Cliff and I had talked about, well, if these two establishments are prohibited uses, we could list them in section 4.3 along with all the other prohibited uses. And I'm just going to look at that section now so I can give you a sense as to what's in there. That's one place within the regulations we could do it. The disadvantage of that is a little bit disjointed from the rest of your cannabis regulations. And someone might not think to look to section 4.3 to understand whether or not those specific establishments are permitted. And so 4.3 mostly prohibits heavy manufacturing uses with certain performance standards, and things like stockyards, slaughterhouses, slag piles, storage of explosives. So it's more almost practices and performance standards based. So point being, I think the best place to regulate that prohibited use is within the use regulations of cannabis establishments, which gets into the details about what is allowed, what is not allowed, how much of it is allowed. It just makes sense to put it all in one place.
This is Lynn. Dave, I think that was a great question. And actually, I worry about these things because I could see somebody later on saying, well, how come it's not listed in the prohibited use section? I don't think there's any negative to having it listed both in the regulation as you've got on the screen, as well as the other. I just do think if people went to what's prohibited use in the town of Stonington and they wanted a total list, they would go to that section for whatever. So is there any issue with putting it in both places?
No, Lynn, I don't think there is. Our general approach in the regulations has been to reduce redundancy and to say things once. And when we say it, we mean it. And so for that reason, we don't have a lot of duplicity or redundancy, of which we eliminated a tremendous amount. And the downside of that is sometimes things get changed in one place and they don't get changed in another. And then you have conflicts or inconsistencies. I don't think that's a risk here. But I also do think if we say prohibited in this section, that it's a declarative statement and there's really no arguing with it. But at the same time, I'm happy to add it to 4.3 as well if you all prefer a belt and suspenders type approach.
Well, let me ask you in a different way, because I
Yeah.
see what you're saying. Is there any other prohibited use that is only listed in the named regulation itself?
Lynn, I'd have to go through and check. There are aspects of uses that are prohibited. Not necessarily, we don't necessarily list types of uses, but there are various aspects of those uses that are prohibited or heavily regulated in some way or another that occur throughout our use regulations.
Okay. Then I guess I'd like to just hear what others have to say, but I'm fine going either way.
I guess I am either. I sort of share your concern that in this case, it is kind of a special subject, and you may want to punctuate it a little bit, and it might make me feel a little more comfortable also. But I wouldn't want to have a formatting issue where we treat this in this manner and because we didn't do everyone exactly the same way, that a prohibited use would be disregarded in another area, if you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean, and I suspect everyone else does as well. We want to be consistent in our application of things, and it's inconsistencies which creates, potential loopholes or conflicts.
Francisco, just looking
I
through
guess
the
I'd be
regulations.
interested in hearing what the public has to say and what some of the other commissioners have to say. Also, we have kind of a attendance here. I know we have Lynn, myself, and
Right.
I love connection, by the way. I apologize. I got knocked off once already this evening here. I've had a terrible internet connection, so I'll keep sending. I apologize, but that's
Okay.
really what it takes for me to take it.
All right, Chuck. Yeah, your audio is very choppy. It may help to turn off your video. It may help your audio a little bit. And Clifton
Okay.
is about to weigh in.
Just looking through
As
the
long as everybody
regulations.
understands.
Just looking through the regulations quickly, the other time that we list out prohibited uses specifically is when we do it in floating zones. And so we identify additional prohibited uses directed to those floating zones. And we call it out in the exact same format Francisco has mentioned here under cannabis establishments.
But those uses, those uses are allowed in other zones within
Correct.
town.
There,
So
it's specific to the zone, which is why it's not in 4.3, because 4.3 is townwide only. And that, yes, that's absolutely correct.
I think it'd be
My
good to put it in both places.
Personally my preference would have been to lump all of the cannabis items together. That way we can point to one page and one section for cannabis. But I think as long as it's in either 5327 or 4.3, I think the intent carries across. I don't think we need the duplicity of it.
So why don't we leave it as is for now, and maybe we can follow up and take the temperature when we have more commissioners online here.
Well, Chuck, these are going to be effective very soon. And so we're hoping to go ahead and make these changes to the document and get the updated document to Clifton and to the planning department as soon as possible.
I guess unless Lynn has a very strong feeling, I'm fine with the way it is.
Yeah, I don't have a very strong feeling. I think it should definitely be listed as it's proposed on the screen. Whether it's listed in the other section, I'm kind of ambivalent about now that we've discussed it a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you,
Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Then we'll do exactly as we've proposed, and that will enable me to get the updated document to Clifton this week.
Thank
Okay. Parking. Based upon our discussion last week, we've provided you two documents, recommendation 35 and 36, that address the parking changes we talked about. And these are two documents because your parking, there are two different areas. Well, there's a minimum of two different areas where we address parking within your regulations. Most of the parking is addressed through section 13. But because off-street parking is also an accessory use, we first deal with it in section 6 under 6.3.10 off-street parking. Section 6.3.10, and this is in recommendation 35 on the left side of the screen, really dealt with the permit thresholds required for off-street parking. We talked last month, there was concern about a loophole that would allow someone to build more than 20 spaces by building 19 at a time without ever having to pull a special permit. We agreed to remove that loophole. So basically now, any parking lot or expansion of parking lot that has 20 or more spaces requires special use permit. Okay, that's exactly what recommendation 35 does. In addition to that, we just cleaned up some of the language for clarity, but what we're really after there is to close that loophole, ensure all special use parking above 20, where all off-street parking above 20 spaces requires a special use permit. Recommendation 36 is the bulk of the work. So we presented your entire parking regulation section of section 13. And as I discussed last month, rather than piecemeal it in a dozen or so different recommendations for each subsection, we packaged it all together, and we've made a series of recommended amendments for that, which ranges from eliminating some of the off-site and shared parking provisions to updating your off-street parking standards to provide off-street parking requirements for uses that currently do not have a specified requirement, and to also update the standards towards more of a gross floor area type requirement. All of that is contained within the recommended amendment, and we've been through this in detail last month, but I realize it's the first time you're seeing it all put together. So with that being said, I'm happy to open up to any questions or comments on that recommendation.
So I have one. I noticed in the chart last month when we talked about this, and I have a particular interest. I'm working on a golf course project in town.
Okay.
And we have we have parking requirements for golf courses. I'm not sure there's ever going to be another one built in Stonington, but the recommendation is for 10 parking spaces per hole. I just had to count them a couple of months ago, and we have 118 spaces, which is 6.5 per hole. So I was a little surprised by that number. So I went out and tried to look at all the other towns in Connecticut that have golf courses. None of them have codes. So I went to the birthplace of golf, or where the golf courses are in the United States, which is Florida. So just a couple of things I found: Fort Lauderdale, 4 spaces per hole, plus 1 per 2 practice tees. Sarasota County, 4 spaces per hole, plus 1 per 300 square foot of floor area. Naples, Florida, 5 spaces per hole. Lee County, 6 spaces per hole. So I think ours is a little high, and it just sort of makes me wonder about the rest of the numbers there. Is this going to cause us problems with other uses?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Does,
so those
does
numbers,
does the number come from ITE, Francesco?
Yeah, it does. It does. And of course, they provide a range. So the higher end of the number is intended to also account for not only the golf course itself, but the clubhouse, associated facilities.
Yeah, and I think other towns look like they take that by adding, doing spaces per use. Somebody has a tennis club, then you need spaces for that. If you have a pool, or if you have a restaurant open to the public, then you have spaces required for the restaurant. But that just, again, seemed really high.
So this is, and I'm glad you started with that discussion with, we don't know if we're going to get another golf course in town. This is one of those very rare uses that I would feel perfectly comfortable leaving it to the commission to work with the applicant to determine the appropriate amount of parking, as we do for some of the uses. You had a lot more uses previously that were decided in that way, or the parking requirement, that is. And I'm perfectly comfortable with maintaining that approach here if you want to be able to be more sensitive to the individual application or establishment.
I think that's a good idea. Golf courses, like you said, can contain a number of amenities.
Yeah.
And almost be like conference facilities in some ways. That can host enormous events, and since and I'm appreciative that as much research was done and shared with regard to what other states and what other golf courses have for parking, and rather than just take something out of ITE, perhaps it should be derived based on the use, a specific study relative to that use, and require a study.
Right.
A parking
Okay.
study.
I'm comfortable with that approach.
I just throw it out there as because the comment makes so much sense. That other facilities are adequately served by less than half of what we're saying, but if the rest of that is needed for what could be tantamount to almost like a banquet facility,
Right.
we would, I think, be well served by having a study for this specific use.
Okay.
Makes sense. I'm not sure we'll ever use it, but
Right.
but
It's just more considerate way of approaching the subject based on
Yeah.
on your comment, and I appreciate your comment.
Okay, very good. Were there other comments or questions along those lines, or on another area of our recommendations?
This
I think
is
it's great
Lynn. Oh,
I think it's
go
great
ahead.
to centralize it the way you've done it, and much easier to read and much more concise. I'm sorry, Lynn.
Oh, no problem. So I'm looking at the recommendation 36 and the bullet point number 7, where it says section 13.3.3, and it refers to kind of like a table,
Yes.
required space per 1,000 square foot floor ratio. Have we gotten there yet? I don't see a table in the slides. I guess I'm not really understanding this. So there'll be a table.
There is a table. It's in,
Okay.
yeah, it's in the memo for recommendation 36.
The memo. Oh, a separate document?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Clifton,
Yeah.
Can you confirm those were distributed?
Yes, Adriana distributed them on, I want to say Friday.
Yeah, I
You
have
sent
it.
it to me, Francisco.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I haven't looked
Yeah,
that
it's no
over.
problem, Lynn. So those documents provide all the details. So the front page of recommendation 36, it's basically a summary of why we made the changes, what sections were modified. And then that follows by a markup of section 13 of the zoning regulations, of line by line markup, where you can see in red things that are stricken or added. And that does include the summary table with all of the uses listed, some of which will remain, that discretion will remain with the commission for some of the more nuanced uses, to which we would add the golf courses.
Okay.
In general, our approach has been, as best we can, to standardize the requirement by gross floor area and to get away from head counts and staffing counts and patron counts and things that are highly variable and difficult to measure.
But then how do you
Yeah.
you really can't equate, as an example, a restaurant with a dentist's office, which could be the same square footage. You
Right.
can't just, so without looking at the document, I can't see how this works. And again, I'm sorry I haven't looked at that document, but I
Yeah.
don't see how you can equate the uses, with just this gross floor
Mm.
area. I mean, there's
Yep.
just such a divergent of
Right.
number of people.
Right.
Isn't
So I'll
the
do my best to
ratio different?
explain. Yeah, I'll do my best to explain that. A restaurant would require more parking spaces per square foot than a retailer or a dentist office.
Oh, so you listed the uses with an amount and then you just
Correct.
multiply it by the thing. Okay, got it.
Yes,
Thank you. All
exactly.
right.
So it's a ratio.
So it is graduated. It
It's a
is
graduated
graduated.
ratio and
So-
it's specific to the type of use. There are many uses that have comparable or the same parking requirement per square foot. And those would be most of the retail uses, many of the office uses. But there are some uses that are far more intense, restaurants and food service especially. And those have a higher parking requirement per square foot.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hey,
And
can
then,
I interrupt for a sec? Ryan Deasy sent me an email or sent us all an email at 6:11 saying he didn't have access. I just responded to his email, but does anybody have his phone number to text him?
Yes, I can text him.
Okay. Yeah, tell him I just sent him an email and the link is there.
Okay, got it. Got it.
Sorry
I'll
to
send him a
interrupt.
text right now. And I overlooked earlier, Dave Resendez is online. I said it was only Lynn and myself. I apologize, Dave. You've been on since the beginning, and
That's quite all right.
just want to acknowledge your presence. Thank you for joining us.
so just to continue on with this slide, bullet point 6, amend section 13.2.5 to limit the parking reduction for shared on-site parking to 25%. What is it currently?
There's no limit.
So how did you get the 25%?
Well, we agreed to limit it. And
Yeah.
so I've started with 25% as a fairly conservative standard.
So I'm just thinking, see, I'm not sure that I think 25% is conservative.
Mhm. Yeah, well,
uh,
I mean, that's exactly why we're starting with a draft recommendation so that we
yeah,
can give it some consideration, debate it, and arrive at a number that you're comfortable with.
yeah.
Ultimately, this is really, we have to just arrive at this by consensus. There's not a right or wrong answer as to what number works perfectly or best. It's really based upon your discretion.
Yeah, and we recently had an application come through for
Yeah.
shared parking, which I know it says in 5 that we're no longer going to or that it doesn't say that in 5, but it's for shared parking and it was for far less than 25%, and we denied it for the shared parking.
Yeah.
A Clifton, Chuck, I can't remember. I want to say it was like 10%.
I don't remember the percent, Lynn. I'd have to go back and check.
Yeah.
I
And
don't have
so
any recollection.
Okay.
you retain your right to approve shared parking. You're not automatically granting it to an applicant. You retain your discretion and authority to approve it and to grant it. This just puts a ceiling on it that you as a commission can't exceed in approval. And you could decide to limit it to 10%. But if you feel, if there's some consensus that 25% is way higher than you would ever go, or than you had gone in the past, then we would reduce that number. I don't know, 20% is the right number, 15, 10. I can tell you our work in other places. By example, we work with the town of Greenwich to develop, to refine their parking regulations. And we developed a shared use parking calculator for them, so they could actually calculate what the true potential reduction could be. And 25% is not uncommon if you have extremely complementary uses with respect to one being very quiet during the day and the other one being very quiet at night and having offsetting activity by time of day. 25% is very easy to achieve. You could achieve reductions up to 50% in the required parking if you have the right combination of uses. So I thought 25% was a fairly conservative number to start with. But if you think it should be lower, we can amend that.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think that, shared parking, as you state in the context,
Yeah,
it's very difficult to monitor. Businesses change hands, the
right.
hours are extended, and what often happens,
Yeah.
to be quite frank, through no one's fault, it's something that's overlooked if a business has changed hands or
Yep.
comes back and says, well, we're just going to do this. We don't go back and say, oh, remember you have shared parking and it's 25%. And the only reason it was 25, we allowed 25% is because you have an offset in hours, etc. It requires kind of a history of whatever changes have been, or anything that's been granted in the past, which, to be honest, gets cumbersome for everyone. And so that, first time through, I can see, but then it gets lost in the shuffle, and that's why I think this number is too high. But, maybe the other people on the line would like to speak to it.
I don't have a scientific sense myself. It does sound high to me, but that's just sort of impulsive. It's not really based on anything. It does seem high as a starting point. It's as Lynn said, it's without negative easements and contracts, and we had a lot of confusion on shared parking. In the one instance I've seen it here, and in my experience, I've seen a lot of problems with shared parking. So I guess I would be more comfortable with the lower starting point as well, just based on negative experience and the difficulty in I'm not going to say enforcing this, but managing it moving forward. Because as Lynn says, I mean, there's frequent changes of use down here, in particularly in restaurants and retail, and it's very difficult to track this, and it's often overlooked. So I guess just impulsively, I would say 20% would probably be as much as I'd ever want to see.
Okay.
And I'd feel better with that.
Okay.
And I apologize, I joined late the link there, but I agree with both.
I see you there, Ryan.
All right. Yeah, we can certainly change that number. It's one digit.
I'm just gonna put it out there. I completely disagree, and actually think the number is too low, just based on literature I've read around parking and shared parking uses. I don't think it's really my place to share that at this time, because I was unable to attend the previous meetings on the subject. But from my perspective as the planner, I think shared parking should be at a ratio determined at the time of approval. And so I think the original language as it is in the regulations, requires, or the commission would require the applicant to do that parking study to show what that number is. And I think just based on the variety of uses we have, that number can fluctuate And then, you know, as uses change time over time, those projects in some capacity come back to the commission. And so I think if there's language in there that says if you have a use change, then that parking or that shared parking agreement gets re-reviewed, then it gives the commission the opportunity to re-review that and see if that ratio is still true. So that's my perspective on it. I would not like to see a ceiling at all and just have it be at the commission's discretion, but that's my opinion.
And thank you, Clifton, for reminding us of the fact that we don't currently have a limit, and we don't have to have a limit because this remains under the commission's discretion to grant. So that's certainly an option before us, is just to get rid of the limit, because the limit suggests a number that people can push towards.
Clifton, this is Lynn. Are you suggesting that anytime an applicant comes in and there's a shared parking aspect, whether it's a new development, whether it's just a change in the business, an extension of hours, which to be honest with you, I don't even think that always comes back, that we require some kind of a formal parking study? And if
So
we did that, then you would not put a maximum percentage?
Yeah, my suggestion is to keep the language as is and then operate how the commission currently does for changes of use. When there's a change of use application that comes before the commission, and it's typically in the form of a site plan, unless it's a use that requires a special use permit, the commission has or the applicant has provided in their narrative for that change of use a total parking calculation to see if it's consistent with the existing use. The examples that I would put before you is any application that we've had recently in a strip mall. We've done the exact same process of re-reviewing the parking to make sure that the original approval of that strip mall and all its multiple uses still fits for the parking requirement with this change of use. So that's how the commission has always approached it. Setting a ceiling in this vein would be an extra limit upon that, in which case, in the case of a strip mall scenario, a change of use from one to another might be a triggering point that would get you from, say, 23 to 26%. And at that case, the individual business that's going into a space in a strip mall would then be required to build a new parking space or new parking areas to accommodate that, because you have that higher limit or that ceiling set. And I think that runs counter to the commission's intent with the language, which is really to make sure that when new construction happens or expansions of use, that they're not fitting the old requirements that they were approved in the case of the application you mentioned. So I think it's always site and use dependent, and that's why I would like to leave it as wide and open for the commission to review as necessary, instead of trying to set a ceiling and then running into an issue later where there becomes a situational constraint that could have been solved by the commission without having a ceiling on it. So I'd just like to operate how we currently do.
Right.
I think that makes, I apologize, I missed a little bit of what you said there, but that's less arbitrary. I mean, and I think I would feel more comfortable than that, than playing around with numbers that are, you know, don't have a lot of science around them or scholarship around them.
Yeah, this gives the commission the opportunity to
force the applicant to make the case.
Right.
This is the commission almost unilateral decision making as it applies to individual application. Whereas if you set a ceiling limit, in theory, what you're implying is that as long as it gets around under that 25%, it should be granted. Not it will be, but it should be.
Mhm.
And so I think you have a harder case when you start setting numbers if somebody wanted to appeal a decision the commission made.
That makes sense.
Agreed.
Okay, let me just ask you one other quick question. Do businesses, because this is how the conversation has gone in the past when we've talked about shared parking. A lot of it revolves around hours of
Mhm.
the business hours, right? If a business changes its hours, it's the same business, but it changes its hours, it does not come back to the commission, correct?
That's correct. And in the case that you're trying to describe, Lynn, I
Yeah.
think when the commission looks at a parking study and say it's a restaurant that says, oh, we're going to be open only for breakfast. But
Right.
if the commission doesn't impose as stipulations of approval, these are your hours of operation, then I think the parking study that would be developed with the application needs to reflect all of the hours that it could be potentially open. And that's where your discretion comes in to say, you know, if somebody's coming in and saying, I'm only operating a breakfast business or breakfast restaurant, and we're closed the rest of the day so we can do shared parking, I think that's where the commission would come in and say, you know, in the case of you trading hands in this business, or you come up with a new idea and want to open for lunch, that number doesn't work for us in this case. And so you still maintain your discretion and you don't have a ceiling set. And so that way it allows you to fluctuate when you give the original approval, not necessarily that applicant has to come back at a later date. So
Okay.
that removes a step of administrative work that we have to do. But it gives you the discretion at the forefront to say, yeah, I don't really believe that those are going to be the long-term hours of this use.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. Yeah, so I agree. Maybe we don't have a maximum. If it does give us greater flexibility as a commission to either deny or approve. And I just think it's kind of a learning thing about the hours. And that's where, somehow I would love to have little notes that say every time something comes through with shared parking, make sure there's hours specified. So if those change, we have to come back and look at it again. But I guess you can't put that in a reg, so.
Okay, any other comments or questions on this? And I had promised Chuck last time that I would try to keep our review of the recommended amendments to a minimum so we could spend most of our discussion on the new material. But that being said, I've realized the first chance we've had to discuss the recommendations together. So
This was a valuable discussion.
Okay.
Valuable discussion.
All right. Okay, any other comments or questions? A reminder, we're not voting on this tonight, right? We're going to table this. And if you want to spend some more time with these recommendations to review them, and Lynn hasn't had a chance to look at the document yet, we are very receptive to you bringing back comments or questions at a further meeting. And we'll always set aside some time. And maybe what I'll do is I'll build in a few minutes or as much time as it takes at the beginning of each meeting going forward for any comments on previously introduced recommendations. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. So I'll move forward then. Okay. So let's talk about buffer screening and landscaping requirements, of which, particularly with respect to buffer and screening requirements, you have them scattered throughout the regulations. And we took a look at this a year and a half ago now as part of our phase 1 work. And we realized there was a lot more to it than we could potentially address through phase one. And we very intentionally deferred that work to now. And with that being said, let's talk about what these terms mean. And these are defined, these definitions come straight out of the back of the document, out of the zoning terminology definitions. So screen or screening is often part of a buffer, not always, but often it's part of a buffer. It's an element of buffer, and it's intended to not really allow visibility through or light through. A buffer itself is really just a landscape area that you don't build in. So it's very often located, it's part of a required setback, and a setback is distinguished by it limits the types of structures that you can build in that area. A buffer is more than that. It requires that area to be landscaped. Not only does it prohibit structures, but it also requires that area to be landscaped. And the buffer widths you require vary considerably. The purpose of the buffer is really to soften edges. Part of the purpose is reduce noise. I can tell you they're not highly effective at that, or odor. You know, it's really a visual. It's for softening edges and separating uses that might not be complementary. Screening is really intended to provide a strong visual barrier to prevent light spillage, to screen unsightly sites like a dumpster or drive-through, whatever it may be. And so your screening requirements require either dense evergreen landscaping, walls, or fences, and typically a minimum of 6 feet in height. And then landscaping is just a general term for landscaping that may or may not be within a buffer, may or may not be associated with screening, and is most often referenced in your zoning regulations with respect to parking lots and the requirements for landscaping a parking lot. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to go through all the places where these requirements show up in their different capacities, and it's not entirely consistent. It's really all over the place. And as I mentioned in phase one, we did our best to put it into the regulations where they belong, realizing there's really more work that should be done to provide something that's more consistent, less redundant, and more user-friendly as well. So let's start with required buffers and screening for specific uses. So these are required for a use. These aren't for a zone, but for a use, and they follow that use wherever it is, in whatever zone it's located in, and regardless of what it's next to. Congregate living facilities. These are residential facilities for seniors that provide a range of different types of living environments and levels of care. So they're residential developments for the most part, but with some institutional functions and some minor healthcare functions. You require a 50-foot buffer on all sides, and all sides means the front side too, and 35 feet of screening. So that's 35 feet of dense evergreen vegetation in combination with walls or fences, which is a lot. And you do allow that 35 feet to be reduced if you include within that screening an earthen berm that's intended to serve a similar function as a wall. And actually, earthen berms are very good for sound attenuation. So on its face, those standards look really excessive for something that is a residential use for seniors. And what we'll do is let me get through all of this, and we'll kind of circle back on these numbers and where to go with it, unless someone really has something that you want to weigh in on now, and I'm happy to receive it. But we do have a lot of slides to get through, so I want to try to keep it moving. Dog daycare and training. You don't have exact numbers here. You just say this commission may require buffers and screening for, I think, for pretty obvious reasons. Existing detached accessory structures used for an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, you require a screening of a minimum of 5 feet in width to be provided between the ADU and adjacent property. So if you have an existing garage there, you turn it into a dwelling unit, you need to put in evergreen screening, combination of fences or walls between that and an adjacent property. Drive-in windows also require a screen in the form of a fence or a wall at least 6 feet high to screen the drive-in lane from any adjacent residential properties. It's not required between commercial properties. Minor accessory buildings, this is a lot like the ADU. If you have a minor accessory building within the required setback, which you do allow for buildings that are less than 200 square feet, you have to provide a fence for that or landscape screening if it is within the setback. Small wind energy systems require screening and landscaping around the base. And it is just a fairly loose standard, just says you need to provide some screening and landscaping. Service areas, and here we're talking about dumpster areas, loading and storage areas, transformers, AC, condensers, that type of thing. Service areas require screening as well. And then, so those are the use-specific buffering and screening requirements. And those are the only uses that are called out as requiring buffering or screening wherever they're located, in some cases, depending upon what they're next to. In addition to that, so we can think of these being layered on, you have buffering and screening requirements per zone. And those vary per zone. And so we'll go through those one by one, starting with your residential zones. In the RR80, you have what I describe as a buffering, or really this is your kind of a non-infringement buffering area of 25 to 100 feet from natural resources. And this is, so that distance is determined by you, by the commission. And you have a little bit of guidance on that in section 15 as to how it is the purpose for which you're requiring a buffer and how it is you are to make that determination. Okay, that now that section is applicable to special use permits in section 15. So here in section 7.4, we don't say special use permit applications shall be subject to a 25 to 100 feet buffer from significant natural resources. But I think that's clearly implied because it references the authority and the standards that are set forth under special use permits. So I think we need to, at the very least, amend this standard for RR80 to make it clear that this requirement is applicable only to special use permits, if you all agree that that is what is intended and that has been the practice. And so therefore, single family home or anything that does not require a special use permit in that zone would thereby not be subject to this buffering requirement. And with that said, I'm happy to open up to Clifton or Chuck or anyone else who has some institutional knowledge about how this works.
We apply it, or the way I have always applied it is only if it's a special use permit.
Okay.
Not for things that we can approve either administratively by right,
yeah,
or even if it's, say, a site plan application.
Okay. I think that's the intention. We just need to fix the language to make that explicitly clear. Okay. All right. So that's what we'll go with. The RA40 zone You have a full list of requirements as well. And I'm sorry for the RR80, I skipped over the fact that you've got a minimum 50-foot buffer for duplex residences, manufactured home parks, and community centers, and then 100-foot for any processing, agricultural processing, and any excavation type activities. In the RA40, your buffer requirement is lesser for duplex residences. You require a 35-foot buffer with 30 feet of planted screening, which is a lot of screening for a residence that hosts 2 families instead of 1. You also require the 100-foot buffer for agriculture and excavation. In this zone, you'll notice item B for the RA40 and item B for the RR80 differ a little bit. In this zone, you require 30 feet of planted screening. And this is exactly the type of work we'd like. Types of issues we see that we want to resolve is just to provide a more consistent standard. It's not clear to me that it was very intentional that 30 feet of screening be required in the RA40, but not the RR80. It's just likely by the way the regs were drafted that someone thought to stick it into the RA40 and didn't think to also apply it in the RR80. So this is the type of work we have in front of us is to flesh all this out. You also have the buffering requirement, distancing requirement from natural resource sources. Once again, we're agreed that that's applicable to special use permit uses. And then on top of that, any special use permit requires 35 feet of buffering with 30 feet of planted screening. Okay. Next is the HI60 zone, where you have what's called buffer yard landscaping requirements. And this is actually a fairly sizable section. I just pulled a screenshot from part of it. The HI60 zone has the most extensive landscaping and buffering requirements of any of the zones. And I think part of the reason being it's one of the more newly created zones, and it has a lot of intentionality with respect to site design and landscaping and all of that. And therefore, it's got a fairly decent set of standards, but that are only applicable to that zone. So I think there are some lessons learned from the HI60 zone that we could consider applying townwide and have a standard that's more consistent townwide, not exclusive to this zone. There may be some aspects of this that are the standards a little too high or a little too nuanced that you want to just limit to this zone. But there are other aspects that I think we should consider townwide. By example, within the buffer yard, it talks about the combination of planting that should be provided as part of a buffer yard or screening. Whereas in all the other zones, we just say buffer screening and put some landscaping in it, but you don't have any guidance or standards as to how many trees or shrubs or that sort of thing. All right. Okay, so what we did is we took all of these standards and we organized them into a table. And I just went over the RR80 and RA40, and I would have been talking for another half hour if I were to try to get through all the rest of these zones page by page and slide by slide. So we took those standards and we put them all into this table so we could better compare what those requirements are across districts. And it's not uniform. There's quite a bit of variance between zones, and also based upon what types of uses, and not only what types of uses require the buffer, but depending on what those uses are next to. So this table I'll go through line by line, so you can hopefully get your head wrapped around all of this. Starting with the buffer requirements for all uses. in the GBR 130 and the RC 120, which are actually incredibly similar zones. One's coastal and the other's more inland. Otherwise, they're remarkably similar zones with respect to their regulatory content. They both require a 100-foot buffer area, and this is also what you might refer to as your non-infringement area. You can't build in it, and you also have to maintain a distance and some natural buffering from any wetland streams, ponds, shoreline, etc. So you have 100 feet there, and that's for all uses. And as we discussed, as we were interpreting it, it's potentially all uses, all special use permits. But there's a little bit of nuance there we need to make sure we get right. Next are duplexes. So duplexes, when adjoining all uses, and interestingly, there's not an exemption for a duplex next to a duplex. So presumably a duplex needs to buffer, each duplex needs to buffer itself from the duplex next door. For all duplexes, you need anywhere from 20 feet of buffering to 50. And so in this number formula, on the left side is the buffer requirement, which is almost always bigger than the screening requirement, because the screening is usually within the buffer. So starting the RR80, and I went through this on a couple slides ago, you require a 50-foot buffer with 35 foot of screening that drops to the RA40. And eventually you get down to the RA15, where you still require a 20-foot buffer, but you don't require separate screening within that buffer. Next, community centers. And the only identified buffering requirement for that is a 50-foot, and this is specific to the RR80, is a 50-foot buffer with 35 foot of screening. The same for manufactured home parks, same type of buffer, both only in the RR80. Processing of agricultural products, that's applicable in the RR80 and RA40, where you require about 100 feet. And as I mentioned earlier, as we saw on the slide before, 30 foot of screening just in the RA40. Special use permit uses. So that's a significant number of uses now, of which of the special use permits you actually allow in residential zones, it's not a huge list. So within residential zones, whenever you have a special use permit use adjoining all use, any uses, you require buffers in the RA40 zones and down. Screening is required in many of the zones, but no, screening is just mentioned. There's no width of screen that's required, hence the question mark. So you require buffers anywhere from 35 feet, and it jumps up and down. 35, it's 25 in the RH10, but it goes back up to 35 in the RA20 or RA15. So somewhere between 35 and 25 feet. Then we go to a special permit use when it's next to a significant natural resource. And here we just talked about this. This is where I had a question as to whether or not this was truly applicable to only to special use permit uses, of which Clifton confirmed that it is. And that distance varies from 25 to 100 feet for the buffer. And for whatever reason, in the RM20, it's 50 to 100 feet, 25 to 100 everywhere else, but 50 to 100 here. And I don't know that that's for a particular reason. It may have just been someone typed in 50 instead of 25 in that zone. I've got a couple more slides like this, so let me just keep going. Okay, so that was your residential zones. Now let's take a look at commercial industrial zones. Here, these requirements are a little less stringent in commercial industrial zones, I think for some obvious reasons, because our primary concern is about disrupting people's places of residence. So Here, most of your regulations are applied just to the TC80 and to a lesser extent to the CS5 and some of the other zones. So let's start with the TC80. As the regulations are written, any use next to any other use in the TC80 requires a 50-foot buffer with 25-foot of screening. Any use, if it's next to a residential use, you have to double that number, 150. The same is true for any use next to a residential zone. So it doesn't matter what's on the property in that residential zone. It could be a non-residential use, but if it's a residential zone, you have to have the same screening requirement. Followed by whenever you're adjoining a hotel, you have to have a 50-foot buffer and 50. So all of that buffer has to be screening. It all has to be incredibly densely planted with some combination of fences and walls or berms. Next is attached housing. In the CS5, you have a 20-foot buffer requirement with 5 feet at the edges of the property when it is adjoining a residential zone. And the CS5 is in most areas, it's surrounded by residential zones. So it's understandable why it's desirable to buffer some uses from residential uses, although attached housing is not a shopping center. It is just homes. And so you've got a fairly sizable buffering requirement between residential uses in this case. Next up are the commercial and manufacturing uses. So whenever you have commercial and manufacturing next to attached housing in the CS5, you need some buffering, as well as the GC60, and the requirements in the GC60 are a lot higher. Commercial and manufacturing use next to any residential zone has buffering requirements across just about all the zones or most of the zones where you allow commercial and manufacturing. And that number varies anywhere from 15 feet up to 100 feet with 50 feet of screening for your industrial zones. And the same is true if you're adjacent to a residential use. So it doesn't have to be just a residential zone. And then commercial uses, when adjoining a residential use in a non-residential zone, also have a buffering requirement in the GC60. And so that's incredibly nuanced. Exempted from that is if the residential is in a mixed use building. And then, as you can see, there's a lot of blank spaces here, which means these are applied very specifically in very specific conditions in certain zones. And these are not blanket requirements. They are really specific to a zone and in some cases to uses dependent upon what those uses are next to. All right, and this is the last part of the table. And this continuing on is just this list just spilled over onto the next page. So we also have food takeout or liquor sales in the CS5. You require a buffer next to a residential use or zone. Restaurants, the only place in town where restaurants require, well, I shouldn't say that because restaurants being a commercial use, if they are in, and I'll go back, if they are in the CS5, by example, as a commercial use, a restaurant would have to have a buffer. But here we call out restaurants specifically. We target just that use in the GC60 with a pretty big buffering requirement when next to a residential zone, regardless of whether or not there's a house on that property next door. Same thing for a school, treat the school the same. And then finally, shopping center as well. And for some reason, a shopping center, you need 100 feet for a shopping center, but a restaurant, you need 75 feet for. There's an important distinction there, or maybe it's not important, but there is a distinction. Okay. I've got a little more content to follow up on all that, but I want to pause now just to get your thoughts and impressions. And I don't have exact solutions for you yet. What I want to do is talk about how you would like to approach this, and then come back to you next month with recommendations as to how exactly we treat all of this.
This is
Can I-
Lynn.
Yep, go ahead.
So,
Hi,
I think this is a great presentation because it definitely shows that we need a lot of work in this area. I
Right.
also think this area is the most non-compliant when we talk about buffer and screening requirements. This
Yeah.
is the most non-compliant section of our regs throughout the entire town of Stonington. I mean, completely non-compliant. It's unbelievable. I think we need to approach this first by cleaning up the definitions of
Mhm.
buffer, screening, and landscaping. For example, the definition for screening says a minimum of 6 feet. Well, does that mean
Yeah, I'll go up to it
six?
for you.
Yeah, 6 feet at the time of planting? Does it mean if it's 35 feet of
Mhm.
screening, is it 35 feet wide and 6 feet high minimum? Like,
Yeah.
what does it mean? It's
Mhm.
you know, so I think the screening also says very clearly that it provides effective year-round visual
Yeah.
insulation, whereas buffer doesn't talk anything about year-round.
Right.
Could just
Yep.
be, I don't know, in the summertime. So I just think that you can't go onto the tables and talking about the specifics between the zones or what's applicable in the zones until we really clearly define these things and we know what we're talking about.
Thank you, Lynn. I
Mhm.
couldn't agree with you more.
Can I ask, in other towns, do they have
Yep.
like 30 feet of screening, 50
No.
feet of screening? I think you
Yeah.
just need it to be effective. It can be 6 feet.
Yes. Yeah.
And I've personally had a job in New York where they made us put in a thick screening. They picked all the plants, wanted us to put larger ones, and then 5 years later, all the ones in the middle were dead because they didn't get any
Yeah.
sunlight. So
Right. These are some of the most excessive or and inconsistent buffering and screening requirements that I've seen in a set of zoning regulations in Connecticut.
Francisco, I was going to echo that 100%. I've seen a lot of zoning codes in my time, and not only is this, as Lynn pointed out, difficult to define, it's also difficult to apply, and it's at least from the staff perspective, both myself and Candy, we've always struggled trying to apply these regulations on a case by case basis, not only for an application when it comes in, but every time afterwards when there's a minor change that can be approved administratively. This is extremely difficult and convoluted. So I agree both with Francisco and Lynn that firstly targeting the definitions, and then secondly, I think my overarching opinion on buffers and landscaping is the intent of them historically and the way they applied in the regulations is to buffer incompatible uses together, and that's most often and most typically against residential ones, not commercial to a commercial, but typically residential to commercial. And so I would think, like, as a frame of reference moving forward, I think that's where I would start the focus is what is the buffer that we apply between a commercial use and a residential use? Because that's really the meat of what we're trying to prevent the screen, or that's what we're really trying to screen. Everything else is, added and additional, but I think that's the perfect place to start after we get the definitions.
Yeah, this is Lynn. I agree with you, Clifton. However, I I think one of the reasons that we have screening, buffer, whatever requirements between commercial and commercial is because we don't want Stonington to look like Groton or whatever the main strip there in Westerly. We want that green. We want the buffer between the big Y and Brewstalons. We don't want two huge parking lots right next to each other and all we're seeing is blacktop. So although I think the residential commercial definitely takes priority,
Yeah.
I we need buffers and screening between commercial because we just don't
Yeah.
want to see the concrete.
I think I agree with you, Lynn, and I think that's where the definitions come into play, because the function of screening is to shield the uses from each other, whereas if you have a landscaping requirement on property edges, the intent isn't to necessarily screen one commercial from the other. This allows you instead to say, in those cases where it's commercial against commercial, yes, we want a dense plant mix, but it doesn't need to be 20-foot arborvitaes on the edge, whereas that's something you would rather want or screen from a commercial to a residential. So I think it goes back to your discussion on definitions is, you don't need to screen commercial from commercial, but you do want a landscaping in between them, so that way it isn't a parking lot against a parking lot.
Yep.
Okay. Anyone else have thoughts on all this?
I do agree with what Clifton just said, and I also agree with what Lynn said. There are cases also where you can have commercial uses of far greater intensity next to commercial uses.
Right.
And although that doesn't happen all the time because generally things are compatible within a zone, but it can happen, and that's kind of a special case. But I'd love to be able to codify what Clifton just said, because it was eloquent and it's exactly what we're trying to achieve. But I'm not sure. Whether that's buffer screening, some combination of the two, or whether it's landscaping. So I'd love to try to capture what he just said and codify it somehow.
Well, that's exactly why we're focusing on this in this meeting and what I'll be focused on between now and next month's meeting. And I trust that we could do exactly that.
Super.
All right.
Appreciate everyone's input. I apologize for coming in and out here. I'm still struggling with a bad new internet connection here.
Okay. Thanks, Chuck. We could hear you very well that time. Thank you.
Great.
All right. Does anyone want me to go to one of these slides and you want to take a look at any of these numbers and get into any of these numbers? Or do we just agree? I've got some general direction here, and do we just agree that I should come back to you with a proposal that reflects everything that was just mentioned?
I think if you have a sense of that, try to work with Clifton and what he just said and come back to us with a modification of this.
Okay.
I do think when you come back, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, looking at this slide, the only thing I would state when we're talking about wetlands, streams, ponds, all of that is under the regulatory nature of the Inland Wetlands Commission. So I don't want any overlap between who has jurisdiction over what. So if we can eliminate that, that's my only comment.
When you come back with any suggestions,
Yep.
if you could somehow at the same time highlight what it is today so that we don't have to keep on flipping back and forth. It just put less on a slide so that
Yeah.
we can see. It's just there's too many variables here not to have it on the same slide. So just
Yeah,
maybe dealing with
it's a
less on
lot,
one.
Lynn. I know it's a
Yeah.
lot. I think based upon the direction we're going, it's going to kind of be, it may be like this. All right, you remember all this the stuff you have now? Okay, throw all that away.
Yeah.
This is how we need to do it. Okay, so.
I also would like to see, and Clifton, you might be more familiar with this. There was one where they talked about, I don't know, was it windmills or something? Uh, uh, what is our stance on solar? Buffering or landscaping around solar?
You don't,
Yeah.
and Francisco, correct me
Yeah,
if
we
I'm
don't have
wrong,
a
I don't
requirement.
believe we have
Yeah.
We don't have a requirement on the screening. We do have a requirement on fencing, but that's just to make sure animals or people don't get into the array. But we
Yeah.
don't have a screening requirement.
Yeah, so I'd like to see that, I'd like to propose that that's added. I've actually heard a lot about this from residents where now that, we're allowing more solar uh panels, etc., on the ground mainly,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
People don't want to see this next to their side yard, right? So, I just think it's something we need to consider as well if it's an addition.
Okay. Thank you, Lynn. We'll take a look at that. I do want to talk about this issue here in duplexes or attached housing or congregate care facility. Is it really necessary that we have screening or buffering requirements between a duplex and a single family home, between a duplex and another duplex? And perhaps you maybe feel that some buffering is required, but do the numbers that we have right now, are those do you think those are reasonable?
This is Ryan looking at it. I don't think it's reasonable, especially having read the definitions we have. It seems a lot.
Historically, a single family residence has a higher financial value. It's just a matter of um, you know, how much money something is worth, right? So you have a single family home and somebody's putting a duplex next to you, the value of your single family home is going to deteriorate. There's no question about it. Having a buffer or a landscaping or screening, whatever we're going to call it, in
Yeah.
between can mitigate that. Having 5 lots side by side, each one with a duplex, will definitely decrease the value, not only of the single family home, but of each of the duplexes. There's just no denying that. So the buffers in these instances are there, I think, to protect the land value.
I can
To be quite
understand what you're
frank.
saying, and this is Ryan. I just think the amounts seem really high.
Yeah, maybe the amounts. I'm just saying that
Yeah, I'm not saying there shouldn't be something, but those amounts are pretty high. That's just kind of what jumps out at me.
yeah, but you've got 20 and zeros too, Ryan.
Oh no, but I'm
So,
looking at where
yeah.
he's saying between the duplexes and the 50 here and Y50 there. So yeah, I'm reading it.
No,
So
I
yeah, I do
agree.
think some of this is financially based.
Yeah, I think
Now,
there's some basis for what you say, Lynn. I also agree with Ryan that, you know, you compare these to other towns also, and I'm not talking, you know, I'm talking towns that would compare to this, and they're very high. These numbers are very high. Not that they should go away, but they should be moderated, in my opinion. I think
No,
I think
no,
we need them for the reasons Lynn stated, and maybe there should be more definition around the quality of and the, you know, the effect of a buffer, but the numbers are very high. It's a lot of screening or a lot of distance. You know,
Yeah, it is.
some
Well, and
consideration,
screening,
some
yeah, Chuck.
consideration for the numbers and maybe the definition also.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to Lynn's original comment that the definition is operative, getting that definition right.
Yeah.
Because to your point, 35 feet of screening, if we're all talking about screening, suppose being really dense and permeable, planted, burned wall, 35 feet of that seems incredibly excessive.
Mm-hmm. It does.
It does.
Whereas
no,
5 feet within a 20-foot buffer would seem like it would do a pretty good job.
I don't
Agreed.
want to throw a wrench in this, but I don't, in Francisco, I think, you know, you can correct me, but then I can also get legal opinion. I don't think the commission, in terms of approval of an application, for example, is allowed to discriminate on the case of property values. So if the intent is to shield properties or screen properties on the basis of property values, then I don't think that that's also legally sound.
But if it's in our regs that it's there, it's sound.
Well,
so we wouldn't.
What I'm saying is, if the intent of the language is to buffer based on the basis of property values, then anybody can take that to court at any time and ask for the commission's reasoning on why do you have this buffer. And if the commission ever said in an application of any scenario that it was because of property values, then basically the court would overturn that. So, you know, since we're talking about it here, I wanted to put it out there that using that as a reason is not going to be legally sound moving forward. And so I just want to make sure that the intent and the basis of providing that buffering or screening or whatever we decide comes from a different perspective.
I think it's
really focused on the use and really
I think the intensity of duplex versus the intensity of single family is as we had talked about in terms of the intensity between commercial uses. You know, the intensity of an auto dealership, you know, next to, you know, someone that's selling landscape supplies, you know, you know, an example. So intensity, it's based on the intensity of the use. And,
I'm just coming
you know,
at it from the
I agree that a
perspective
court would have a ball with the, you know, a property devaluation argument. I think there's a lot of substance to it, but we can't couch it.
I think the courts would also have interesting comments if, you know, you're saying a duplex is twice as intense as a single family residence when it's both residential. You know, we talk about in other facets, not necessarily always planning and zoning, but when we talk about it, housing need and other facets, you know, instead of the solution that everybody comes into town with for housing ends up being these large high rises that, you know, everyone will come to the public meeting and speak out against. And when the real solution to the, you know, our local, our regional, our national housing problem is really that missing middle form of housing, which is duplexes and triplexes. And so if we're, I'm not saying alienating it, but if we're saying that it's so negative in comparison to everything else, then your housing pressure is going to go from one extreme to the other. Either you're going to get large subdivisions of single family homes, or you're going to get high rises. So as much as we can facilitate that missing middle development, we're going to have, statistically, we would have less applications of those high rises because we're allowing the market to fix itself. So I do have a little problem calling it even higher intensity use, just because it doesn't really fit the mold of how residential is applied.
Okay.
Understood.
Thank you, Clifton. Yeah. Okay. I appreciate all the comments and the perspective that you bring. It helps orient me and provide me a context by which I can move forward in developing a set of recommendations for you to review. All right. Are there any other comment? I realize I just introduced that line of discussion, but are there any other comments or questions on these buffering and screening requirements, or any other guidance you care to give to me as I move forward this month and to try and address this? All right, next up is landscaping as related primarily to parking lots, which is where, as I mentioned earlier, is where most of your landscaping requirements are located. And some of what we just talked about in terms of high intensity uses and buffering at the edge is really connected to the parking lots themselves, not necessarily the building and the comings and goings in and out of the building and, you know, spaces associated with the building. It's the cars and the cars being parked and the headlights and the noise and slamming car doors and all of that is generating most of the intensity, activity, and potential nuisance. Therefore, we do have a whole nother layer of standards associated with parking lots. And so let's take a look at those. And I did have a couple more slides here. So you have, in addition to your base zoning districts, you have buffering requirements for most of your floating zones as well. And they each, because each of these zones was crafted somewhat independently of one another, they all have their own kind of language and set of standards. By example, performance buffers. I don't know what that means relative to another buffer. Like, is it like high performance? Is it really, really good, effective buffers? It's not defined. And so we just need to get rid of that term and describe what's required. And so that's true. This is the MHD, Maritime Heritage District, the NDD, once again, performance buffers and standard buffers. I think performance buffers means the integration of screening because it describes fences, walls, and berms. So it sounds like they're talking about screening. Standard buffers, you have non-infringement areas, et cetera. The GDD as well. So there's some commonalities between these. They're kind of borrowing from each other, but incredible inconsistencies. More in the GDD and its own set of standards, some planting requirements, a lot of detail here. The AHD, same thing. It's got a buffer requirements section. And then I had more here than I remembered having. I apologize. I was suggesting we were moving on to parking shortly, and then there's just so much. So in addition to all of the buffer requirements we just reviewed, which are associated with a use, associated with the zone, and in some cases associated with special use permits in the zone, you have this section 15.2.8 that is referred to by some of those other areas that has more specific guidance that it provides to the commission relative to special use permits. And so here it is right here. It says commission shall have the power to approve, deny, or modify any proposal, including following stipulations of approval or modification, including special screening or landscaping to screen adjoining properties to mask obtrusive structural features. So on top of all the buffering and screening requirements that are codified for each of the districts and all of the uses, you have kind of blanket authority to apply any standard you want on top of all of that right here in item A. Set extra buffering requirements ranging from 25 feet to 100 feet. This is the same 25 or 100 we saw called out individually for all the different zones. So here, this is somewhat duplicative because it says it again in this section. So that definitely needs to be cleaned up because it's clear to me that's the same thing because it's to 25 to 100 foot from fragile environmental features, but it looks like it may be two separate things. And then the rest is really has more to do with buildings and that sort of thing. So we've got a lot of work to do in different sections of the documents. Ideally, we're going to put this all in one place, and we still may point to buffering and screening and landscaping requirements under your special use permit authority. But ideally, we just say that special use permits shall comply with the buffering and screening standards as required in section whatever, and that the commission has the authority to modify those standards as needed for whatever purpose stated, of which we will not say anything about protecting property value, but it's really about protection, health, safety, general welfare, environmental protection, screening of unsightly features, reduction, mitigation of nuisance, that sort of thing. Okay. So we've talked about this already. So this is what I think we need to do. We need to modify take the HI 60 buffer requirements, use that as a model or a template, and consider building some consistent standards around that are applicable to buffering and screening requirements across all zones. And then potentially provide a summary table for different uses and zones that puts everything in one table, what your buffering or screening requirements are, kind of in the way I did in this slideshow, but ideally a more simplified version of that. And make things, try as best we can, make things standardized and consistent, while at the same time leaving some flexibility and some, and ensure that you have the authority to modify those standards as needed. All right, finally, as I promised 5 minutes ago, parking area, buffer, and landscaping requirements. Okay, here's another element, and this is a buffer, I guess. It's called, when we talk about parking lots, we call it a buffer that is along the street. It's in the front yard. Is called in front of a parking lot. It's called a frontage strip landscaping. Maybe we should call this a buffer. I don't know. We'll work on that. So you do have frontage strip landscaping requirements along a parking lot, and here it is spelled out in item A. Any parking located in a required side or rear yard shall be separated from the property line by a landscape buffer strip. So that's rear and side. When you abut a street, that's your frontage strip, presumably. A landscape strip shall be provided in accordance with this table right here along the entire frontage. And there's certain conditions for a sidewalk. And certain conditions potentially requiring a hedge, wall, berm, raised planter of at least 30 inches in height. However, it is not required for parking associated with single-family, duplex, or triplex residences. But presumably any other off-street parking other than those uses is required to comply with this standard, which I can hear Lynn saying right now that we don't do a good job of mandating this and requiring it and ensuring that these are properly built or maintained. The landscape strip, the width of it varies based upon the size of the parking lot. It ranges from a minimum of 10 to 25 feet. You have other buffering requirements. All parking lots shall provide a buffer for adjacent residential land uses. So if you're adjacent to a residential use, you also have to require a buffer. It seems like, okay, so here's the distinction. What's called a landscape buffer strip here is only required if you're within the required yard, if you're within the required setback. So presumably, you don't have to provide that landscape strip if you are not in the setback, unless, next slide, unless you're adjacent to a residential land use, in which case you do need to provide a buffer. And then there is a screening requirement as well. And then a little bit more detail on the minimum burn or a planted screen. And of course, again, the Planning and Zoning Commission may deem additional area as required. And this kind of language is kind of peppered throughout. And just little stuff, we've got a minimum berm or planted screen, a minimum of 10 feet wide, so that's redundant. We don't know, it says may deem additional area is required. We don't know if that's intended to mean area, like square footage, or if it's intended to mean width. It also have questions about your discretion to reduce. This is just saying that you can add extra area, but it doesn't say that you can reduce under your discretion. So this is problematic for a lot of the reasons I just stated. Okay. Next, buffers shall also be provided in accordance with the table below, so the table that you see, unless demonstrated by the applicant that the adjacent topography or other factors provide sufficient protection. And I think that's a pretty good out, because it doesn't make sense in every condition to have to require a buffer if there's some sort of natural feature or barrier already in place. What's kind of confusing about all this is we just keep layering things on. So we start out with a frontage strip requirement and a buffer requirement if the parking is in a required yard. And then we move on to a buffer requirement if you're adjacent to a residential land use. And then we have these buffer requirements based upon the zone. And in some cases, it's dependent upon what you're adjacent to. And so here in your R zones, you require a buffer adjacent to all uses if you're in an R zone. I guess that kind of makes sense because your surrounding uses are most likely going to be residential. Even though we go back to this, you already require a buffer against any adjacent residential land use. So here we're kind of doing it again. We've got standards that range from 10 to 20 feet here. And if we go back to this requirement, you notice there's no buffer distance specified. There's just a screen, an evergreen screen or planted screen requirement, 4 foot in height or 10 foot wide. So presumably this buffer width is affected by this table. So we've got, it varies from 10, 15 up 20. We get into your commercial zones. And here, to Clifton's point earlier, our biggest concern is about commercial uses next to residential. Here we do specify that you only have to provide that parking lot buffer if next to a residential use. And it's 25 feet in some of these bigger lot zones, and in these small lot zones, it's 20, so that a lesser standard seems to make sense. But you also give yourself the authority to reduce it to 0 feet. A little caveat right there, 0 feet. Applied to all of these is footnote 1, the property use is also required to comply with the underlying zoning district buffer requirements, and the more restrictive buffer shall apply. So everything we talked about 10, 15, 20 minutes ago still applies. So you have those buffer requirements, and you have these separate requirements that follow parking lots around. And whichever one is stricter is the one you go by. So if the stricter one is the one for the zone in general, you can just ignore all this, is basically what that says. Furthermore, you do have a preservation of vegetation requirement in your parking area section. So if you're clearing an area for a parking lot, you've got to preserve as much of the natural vegetation as possible. We already have a separate section of the regulations, section 12.4.1, that has almost this exact language as applicable to any kind of development on a site. And there is also a site plan requirement. When we talk about all of this needs to be clarified on the site plan, and you have to identify location, botanical name, and size, all that of dimensions of planted material. Your site plan standards and requirements identify all of that. So this information is useless because your site plan requirements require you to list that anyway. So that's unnecessary redundancy. So this whole section could go, because the preservation of vegetation is addressed by 12.4.1. The plan requirements are addressed by your site plan requirements. So this is an easy one. Just get rid of it. Next are your general design standards for parking area landscaping. And, you know, these look okay. They're very typical of what I might see in another community, in that you require some islands, you require some trees. There's a general ratio of landscaping and islands relative to the size of the parking lot or the number of parking spaces. So this looks all very familiar. I hope that it's working for you. And so my question is, are these standards effective? Do you constantly have to modify them and give people relief from these standards? Are they enough? Are they insufficient? Do they not require a developer to do enough to soften a parking lot and provide landscaping? So that being said, I'm happy to receive any input on that you can share with me.
Regarding item 3B on landscaped islands, where you have the stormwater runoff, that's already guided by our technical standards. So that language can be removed because when the town engineer and the applicant's engineer review these projects, we point to our technical standards for stormwater runoff. So that section's already addressed.
And we actually talked about this one a little bit last meeting, and Alyssa weighed in on this as well, because I had some issues with this. This item's a bit of a mess. First of all, it starts out with when possible. So that's an advisory standard. It's a recommendation. It's a should and not a shall. But then further on, we get into the rain gardens, and then we have a shall. So those are incongruent. And then at the end, there's this kind of weird thing where, oh, by the way, if you use curbing associated with any sort of vegetated islands or rain gardens, it has to be granite. And Alyssa gave me a little insight that there was kind of a backdoor requirement to encouraging people not to put in curbing and to instead send water into rain gardens by requiring that the curbing be granite, which it's pretty expensive. So this whole thing's a bit of a mess. And so Clifton, if I'm hearing you, we could, for the most part, maybe reference the use of infiltration islands and rain gardens, and that they shall comply when used. They shall comply with the town's technical standards document. Is that the approach you'd like to see?
Yeah, I mean, if we leave it at that broad,
Yeah.
I mean, we have a whole section on LID and the technical standards that we're currently updating. So
Okay.
all of these elements, even the landscaped island elements, would be, pointed to through that process. So,
Okay.
I think the concept is important to note, but the details necessary to achieve that just can be pointed to the technical standards.
Okay. And this is not a requirement. You're not requiring people to build in vegetated islands or on-site infiltration within a parking lot. You're encouraging it, and then if constructed, it should meet the technical standards, right? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. In order to achieve whatever the stormwater related objective is,
Right.
that's when it becomes open for conversation. And so the applicant and then the town engineer occasionally will go back and forth on how best to meet that requirement.
Okay.
But the elements of it, whether it's soft landscaping, rain gardens, or hard structures underneath the surface of the parking lot, that's between those two parties. And so we point to all of those options in the technical standards. So I think, in this case, just if we had language that just said, you adhere to the technical standards, we can address all of the items in at least item B here.
Okay. Okay. All right, we can do that. And anything else on this? How do people feel about the amount of islands that you require relative to the number of parking spaces and the tree planting requirements or the shrubs? Does this work for you?
This is Ryan. I like, more islands, more trees, just overall. I think it works.
Okay. It's a reasonable standard. Each parking space takes up, when you include the area of the aisle you need to access it, each parking space takes up about 300 square feet. So to require, 8% or so of that to be landscape, it seems like a fairly reasonable requirement, not an onerous one.
Not sure if you can hear me or not, Francesco.
Yeah, Chuck,
I'd like
go
to
ahead.
see the caliper of the tree increased to 3 inches.
Okay. The difference between the two being, and I speak from experience, 2-inch caliper you can plant fairly readily by hand with a ball cart. You can dig the hole for it and you can muscle it in 2 people. 3-inch caliper, you need a piece of equipment to move that. So that's the difference between the two. And money,
That's a
money too.
tremendous difference.
About $200. Yeah, there is. They're a lot taller, but about $200 difference, depending on the species.
This is Lynn. Point A, provide a minimum of 20 square feet of interior landscaping for each parking space.
Yeah.
And then later on, so do we actually do that? Can somebody tell me that we do that? I don't think we do.
We do require the landscaping element, but whether it's just grass, a grass island, a tree, or a rain garden, the objective that we've applied and the town engineer applies is that the purpose of these landscaping elements is to help infiltrate stormwater. How it's landscaped in order to do that becomes less relevant than the fact that it's infiltrating the stormwater.
And also to reduce urban heat island effect, as well as the visual benefits.
Yeah, the tree caliper, you know, I agree with Chuck, and you know, adding more trees is always beneficial. Again, you know, this is something that instead of putting it in the regulations here, we can also put it in our technical standards, and so that way it's easier to update over time if that number needs to change.
But in downtown Mystic, where there's parking lots, every space does not have 20 square feet of interior landscaping. There are parking lots that have 0 interior landscaping.
Right, and just to be clear, and perhaps the wording of this needs some improvement. It's not that every space has to have a set aside of 20 feet. Is that cumulatively per space, you would have the equivalent of 20 square feet, which could be provided in one or more islands anywhere in the parking lot. And I'm hearing from you, Lynn, that there's just nothing, right, in some areas. And that's likely because those parking lots precede these regulations.
That's true, and the way the language reads here as well is that it doesn't say, I mean, interior landscaping is anywhere interior of the site, not interior of the parking lot too. So somebody could say that the landscaping that they put against the building or around the structure itself is the interior landscaping that counts towards the parking lot. The language is ambiguous.
Yeah, so maybe we need to work on that a little bit.
Yeah.
I still don't think we
Okay.
meet it in downtown Mystic at all, especially with all the new buildings that have gone up. We haven't done this once. So, okay.
Okay. All right. Well, let's continue because there's a second half to this. So we do have requirements for shade trees and ground covers, and just some issues with the grammar here. Planting iron, requirements for how planting islands should be situated. And we actually, if you go to the regs, we've got a nice visual that we developed in phase 1 to help communicate what this means. Tree uses in parking lots, we do have a little bit more. We dealt with caliper earlier, but we have a little bit more here on what types of trees should be used. Their placement, and mixed into these landscaping requirements, we have pedestrian walkway requirement, which is really a circulation requirement, not a landscaping requirement. So that should be put in a proper place, not mixed in with landscaping. We have references to plan requirements, and I talked about this earlier. This last sentence, this is addressed by your site plan requirement unless we think that there's, well, once again, if it's a zoning permit, it wouldn't necessarily be associated with a plan requirement. I would really presumably this would show up in a plan in a site plan or a special use permit that has a site plan requirement. So we have some cleanup work to do here, and I think this is mostly about more effectively communicating the regs. But I think these standards, in general, they look okay. All right. So the tree stuff is, and here's another area where maybe we can improve it, because the tree stuff is scattered. It's in 2 different places in the prior section. And here is where we talk about the actual number of trees that are required. Before we talked about caliper and the nature of the trees, and here we get into the actual number that are required. So what you require is that any parking lot of 20 spaces or more, and before I lose this train of thought, we have a threshold for tree planting that's associated with the size of the parking lot as measured by the number of spaces. If we go back to these landscaping requirements, we don't have a threshold for the size of parking lot. We do exclude single-family duplex and triplexes. Outside of that, you could have a parking lot, I guess, of 4 or 5 cars for another use. And we still, they're still going to have to comply with interior landscaping, whatever that means, and we need to figure that out. And the rest of these requirements. And is that what you want? It doesn't matter how big it is? Or is there a reasonable threshold to set that really we don't care if it's 3 or 4 or 5 spaces, it's 10 spaces or more, or whatever it might be? Is there a threshold that you'd like to apply here? Or we just stick this on any off-street parking with the exception of single duplex, triplex?
I think the threshold should be potentially any time you have a perpendicular to perpendicular aisle.
Okay.
So if you have 2 vehicles at a 90-degree angle facing each other in the parking lot, typically that's the place where you put that interior landscaping or that stormwater element.
Right.
So I know that's not a threshold by count, but that's a threshold by orientation.
Okay.
Otherwise, if it's just, a straight in, 45 or a 90-degree perpendicular parking, one way, I don't know if there's interior landscaping to provide because there is no interior at that point. It's either the edge of the property or it's the interior where the structure is.
That brings us right back to what does this mean by interior? And I think this set of standards, this minimum area requirement for landscaping associated with the parking lot, we probably shouldn't strictly tie it to the idea of interior. It may be desirable to require a minimum amount of interior landscaping. So if you had a parking lot with 200 spaces, that there's something in the middle of it to break it up. But I think it all hinges upon what interior is intended to mean. And to your point, is really, I'm not sure it's necessary, and it's definitely can be really difficult to integrate interior landscaping into a tiny 1 aisle parking lot that serves 3 or 4, even 10 cars.
Yeah, I mean, I believe the intent is kind of how Lynn described it. The first go around is we don't want a sea of blacktop. And I think the intent of interior is between those parking spaces or between those drive aisles is where you would apply this form of landscaping. Otherwise, an applicant probably just could come around and say, I'm going to put the sea of parking here in the middle, and my landscaped element is just accounted for on the side.
Right, all at the edges.
So I think the intent is, how the parking lot is laid out, and that's where the landscaping goes in. And so if we didn't have a hard and fast threshold and just said, if it's this orientation of multiple drive aisles, then you have to have something in between those drive aisles. Then I think that meets the intent of the regulation.
Okay. The way we've handled that in other places and the way other communities handle that within their regulations is to provide a an island requirement based upon bays, parking bays, and then parking spaces. So a parking bay would be considered an aisle with parking on either side, like at the grocery store. And you couldn't have more than 2 bays in a row without an island separating them. And as one example, or you could require an island between each bay for that matter. And then the other way, so that's kind of the parallel buffering or island approach. And the other way is the perpendicular island approach, where you can't have more than 20 spaces in a row without one of those spaces being occupied by an island that is perpendicular to the aisles and in the same orientation as the parking spaces, just basically taking up a couple of parking spaces. So there are a couple of approaches that are more sensitive to the scale of the parking lot versus just a square footage requirement based upon space. I do think you could have both. You could have a certain amount of landscaping in area that you require, and you could provide flexibility to allow that to be interior and on the edges, while at the same time ensuring that you have a standard that requires islands separating a certain number of bays and a certain number of spaces. So I think those could work hand in hand as well.
I personally I support that approach, and I think the key here is the visual descriptor, either as we put it in the definitions or put it in the section itself. And so if it's a buffer between the bays, well, the visual to describe the bay and then what the buffer or the landscaping is in between, and then the lateral, the islands in between, 10, 20 spaces. I think that meets everybody's objective, or at least the intent of the regulation here, just in a simpler visual format.
And so like we've done in other places in the document, we could provide a graphic that paints that picture right away and helps reinforce our written regs.
This is Lynn. I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so we'll prepare something, and we can revisit it and adjust the numbers accordingly to get the right fit. But we'll rough something out. Okay. But I think the issue here is the vagueness, and it goes right back to what does interior mean, and then how do you meet the standard for a tiny lot? And that's where this starts to fall apart. All right, back to where I started. So here you have a very clear threshold, and you're only requiring planting of trees for parking lots over 20 spaces or more, and then we talk about if that's the right number. And so the requirement is 1 tree for every 10 spaces. So if you do have 20 lot space, you really only have to provide 2 trees. And well, that's on the interior. Let me correct myself. 1 tree for every 10 spaces on the interior. So within those islands on the interior. So now we clearly have a threshold that if you got 20 car parking lot, somewhere in there you need to fit in an island or a couple of islands, and there has to be trees in them. Next are the perimeter trees. So this is a requirement on top of those interior trees. 1 shade tree for every 40 feet of parking lot perimeter, and they don't have to be planted every 40 feet, but for the equivalent, they could be clustered in some areas. And then 1 shade tree for every 40 feet of parking aisle. So you have both a perimeter and an aisle requirement, which kind of makes sense because on a really, really big parking lot, 40 feet along the perimeter takes care of your perimeter. And then you have these interior parking requirements, but you also have all these aisles that really add a lot of area. And so you have another requirement associated with all of the aisles. Which seems to arrive at the point where you have a fairly high standard for trees that are required. Now, I don't know what your experience has been with those being planted in strict accordance with these requirements, and what the success has been in successfully getting those trees established. But on its face, the requirement seems to effectively communicate what's required, and it does. It's a relatively high standard, but I don't think exorbitant standard for tree planting. All right, any thoughts on that?
I think we get robust landscape plans here. I think we have a good community of landscape architects, and in general, I mean, there's exceptions. We had a recent application that, was void of any landscaping, and we had to put a condition on that. But in general, the landscape architect community is very active in Mystic and Stonington and all our jurisdictions. And I think we get a robust with well done planting schemes.
Okay.
So this is Lynn.
Yep.
So, and I'm sorry I had to step away for about 5 minutes, a little bit ago, but we had slides where we talked about how big the trees had to be.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be in this section too?
Yeah, I think you missed the part where I said that all of your tree planting requirements were scattered across multiple sections, and that it may be desirable to put everything in one place.
Okay, so ideally, this would somehow say, a 3-inch caliber, 10 feet high, or something like that. Okay.
Yeah, it's pointing to that section where we say all that. That's what this is, the reference 13.8.3 is trying to do.
Okay.
But it may make sense to put everything we require of trees in one place. Well, I'll take a look at that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, anything else on trees?
I'll just say, Francisco, in terms of you asked how we apply it or enforce it.
Yes.
Landscaping trees, whatever, they die. The way that we've applied it when asked by the property owner is you have to replace the landscaped element, but not the tree in kind. And so if it says you need to have trees in your parking islands or in between those bays, you have to have trees there, but it doesn't have to be the kind that was originally approved, just because landscaping changes over time. That's the way Candy's applied it.
But it would have to be the same size tree.
Well, that's what I'm saying is we don't do that. We say a tree is a tree in that case.
So they go down to Home Depot and grab a 1-inch red maple and throw it in.
Yeah.
Why?
That's the way it's applied. Just because not the old landscaping plans that we're referring to, or the old site plans that were approved, didn't specify the tree. And so we don't have something to say it was this type of tree, 20 years ago when you got the site plan, so you have to plant that again.
I see. I see.
We really just point to it as, this is a landscaped element, replace it with like or similar landscaping, but not the same.
But is there a reason you couldn't say, and I totally understand you might not want the same species of tree. I completely see what you're saying, but this perspective, the application I would think is you go to the reg and you say the reg says you need a 3-inch caliber 10-foot tree. that's your starting point. Whether it's a apple tree or a pear tree is up to you.
Mhm.
Is that,
Yeah,
and you're saying you don't do that, you say you can put in a stick.
well, correct, because it's in the cases that I'm referring to, it's a previously approved site plan. So just because it's been previously approved with landscaping doesn't mean if that landscaping was replaced, it needs to meet the current requirements, because that's not how it works. It's whatever the landscaping was at the time it was approved. And so if it's not defined, either in that site plan or landscaping plan or elsewhere, then it's basically just replace the landscaping.
If it is defined,
Furthermore,
if it is defined,
yeah,
you have to put what's
if it's an
defined, right?
arborvitae, if it's an arborvitae for the purpose of screening, then you put that back if it's dead. But if it's something that just says this is a landscape area with trees, and it doesn't define the trees, we can't point to anything to say you have to put these type of trees there. Furthermore, just landscaping in general is like extremely difficult to regulate and enforce over time, because plants grow and change, or even die and get replaced. And so any language that we can have in there to account for that in the future, I don't want a rigid set of landscaping plans that the zoning enforcement officer has to go back in 5 years and count those trees.
Right.
That's not how it's intended to, that's not how zoning's intended to be applied. So I would like to have a landscaping plan that, says this is kind of what needs to happen, and then over time that's allowed to change. But something that is that rigid is just not going to be enforced because we don't have the staff for it.
But I'm hearing what you're saying. But if the regulation says 3 inches, 10 feet, that's what you got to put in. I understand if there was an old regulation, or it was, in 1980, and we didn't have a regulation that specified 3 inches, 10 feet. But if at the time that plan was approved, the reg said 3 inches, 10 feet, then that's what it needs to be replaced with. Otherwise, why are we talking about this?
That's what I'm saying is difficult to enforce over time. And, we need to have some flexibility after the point of the site plan being approved. This is the landscaping that needs to be put in to get the CO, but then as things change over time, I don't think that it's the responsibility of the town or the zoning enforcement officer to enforce that landscaping plan.
Well, maybe it's a side conversation.
I'd love to hear how other municipalities do it, but in all my experience, after landscaping for the project is approved, it doesn't really come back into an enforcement realm.
Right. And sometimes there is a requirement for maintenance for a specified period of time. It's usually not more than a year, requiring the applicant to replace any materials that aren't successfully established within a year. And then for some projects that can be tied to the bonding requirement.
Correct.
But
that's what we currently do.
Yeah.
And so all of the planting needs to be established at the time of the bond release. So, all the infrastructure gets put in to get the CO, the landscaping needs to be in place as approved when they come for the bond release. But then after that point, there's zero enforcement of whatever that landscaping is.
Why don't we try to agree?
guess-
Why don't we try to agree on a standard for approval of a site plan and come back to the enforcement issue? Because that applies to other issues as well. So why don't we leave that for tonight? in order to move this forward, but come back to it, when we have some more time to talk about enforcement. Okay. And
Yep.
try to come to an agreement on tree requirements for new uses and
Yeah.
new site plans.
Thank you, Chuck. And as a reminder to everyone, our last piece of work is to review your administrative standards and requirements, including site plans, special permits, and everything associated with the administrative and enforcement aspects of the zoning. So we're going to get a second crack at this.
Right.
Okay. All right. So our recommendation, my recommendations to all of you, and I think you're with me on this, are to improve the language for clarity of multiple sections that we talked about. Remove that section. I said it was redundant, and that's 13.8.2. Consider making parking lot buffer width consistent with the buffer width for the use zone. So we want to take a look at that because the parking lot buffer width says the higher standard shall prevail. So let's just take a look at that and see if we can't come up with a consistent standard across the two.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also talked about providing a more specific and clear definition of what interior landscaping is and developing a set of interior standards based upon the size of lot, number of bays, number of spaces, and providing some supporting visuals for that, along with specifying 3-inch instead of a 2-inch caliber tree. So I'll take all of that and run with it. All right, so we got through it. Our next steps in this process are to prepare the recommended buffer screening and landscaping amendments. I'll also revisit a couple of the items we talked about relative to the parking requirements, including changing the golf course requirement to commission determination. We also need to get started in reviewing your sign regulations and walking you through those at our next meeting and hopefully coming up with some preliminary recommendations as to how we should amend or improve those. We've been sitting on this for a little while because we all been busy. We have yet to conduct a virtual public presentation of the recommended commercial zone amendments. We had conducted a virtual presentation of all prior recommendations for the different areas, residential, environmental, et cetera. We have yet to do that. So we should get that scheduled while that's all still fresh in our minds. And then we've conducted a workshop in support of all of our other phases of work, but we have yet to conduct a workshop for site design, buffer, parking, or signage. And I think we need to figure out what would we want to get out of that workshop? What should be the focus of it? Do we want to try to cover all of that? Is one or two aspects of it the most important? If we were to do a workshop, maybe we could do breakout sessions. You could choose, do you want to go talk about buffer requirements? Do you want to talk about parking lots and landscaping and parking requirements? Do you want to talk about signage? We could do breakout sessions. And then finally, we should get that, if we're going to do that, we should get it scheduled in the next couple of months while this is all fresh, and then early enough in the process where it can form some of our recommendations and decision making, and maybe get more out in the process. It'll just reinforce it and help us refine them. But I do think this is likely the last workshop that we need. I don't think we need to workshop site plan requirements and special permit requirements and administrative procedures. But I think this is something that might be of interest in the community to attend, and it could be an engaging discussion. So we I would need to coordinate with Clifton and of course, you know, take a look at all your meeting schedule as well in order to get that scheduled. All right.
Sounds good.
Okay. Our next meeting is a month because February has 28 days. It's a nice clean 1 month away on the 26th of March at 6 p.m.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good
Thank you.
night.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night,
you,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you all for attending.
Good night. I appreciate the feedback.
Thank you,
Night all.
sir. Good job, Francisco.
Thank you, Chuck. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.